Hi, everyone. Hope you guys enjoyed the wonderful keynote speech and lunch. We're now going to start with our last segment of the day, our panel 2, where it's about national security and global security and how it intersects with race.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Beth Stephens. I'm a professor here at Newark. This is my first time as a full-time professor, so I don't know most of you. And I'm very pleased to have been asked to moderate this panel. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of our speakers. Our panel is on policies surrounding national and global security and how they intersect with race. So I'll just first start by introducing each of the panelists. First, we have Omar Farah, a senior staff attorney at the Center for Constitutional Rights. He's the lead lawyer in Color of Change, the Department of Homeland Security and Federal Bureau of Investigation, which seeks records that reveal the government's expansive surveillance of the movement for Black lives. Omar focuses on CCR's litigation and advocacy in response to abusive policing and counterterrorism practices, including unlawful surveillance of Muslim American communities and the criminalization of dissent and systematic unlawful policing practices. He's also litigated on behalf of several current and former Guantanamo Bay prisoners. Omar regularly speaks about law and policy at the intersection of national security and the criminalization of Black, brown, and immigrant communities in the United States. His work has been covered by major news outlets and published, and he's published many opinion pieces. He's a graduate of Columbia and Georgetown Law School. You all know Professor Aziz. Should I leave it at that? No, no, I'm kidding. Sahar Aziz is Professor of Law, Chancellor Social Justice Scholar, and Middle East and Legal Studies Scholar here at Rutgers. Her scholarship adopts an interdisciplinary approach to examine intersections of national security, race, and civil rights, with a focus on the adverse impact of national security laws and policies on racial, ethnic, and religious minorities in the United States. She also investigates the relationship between authoritarianism, terrorism, and the rule of law in Egypt. Sahar is the founding director of the interdisciplinary Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. She's a faculty affiliate of the African American Studies Department here and an editor for the Arab Law Quarterly. She's earned a JD and MA in Middle East Studies from the University of Texas. And Germana D'Alberto works at the United Nations Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions and of the Department of Peace Operations in New York. Throughout her career, she has worked with international organizations, public service, and civil society groups to advance security sector reform, human rights, and gender equality in transitional and post-conflict settings. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Sao Paulo. She holds an LLM in criminal law and a master in sociology. And in 2014, her study on democratic transition was awarded a prize as the best research in Latin America by the Council of Social Sciences. The opinions she expresses today at this event are her own and may not represent the views of the United Nations. So I'll start things off by asking if each of the panelists would please tell us a little bit about your work and how it touches on national and global security concerns and how those concerns intersect with race and Islamophobia. Omar?
I wasn't sure which way you were going to start.
Sorry.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers. You know, it's not often that we put race front and center in conversations about national security, so there's just sort of like a cool and really refreshing approach to having a conversation that centers what, to me, feels like the sort of indispensable part of any intelligent discussion about what it is that's happening with the national security state, and I think my co-panelists would agree with that. For those of you who don't know, the Center for Constitutional Rights is a 52-year-old civil rights litigation and advocacy organization born out of the civil rights movement in the South. Some of our proudest moments in the early days were representing Fannie Lou Hamer in the 80s, winning some really important victories against the Ku Klux Klan, and a little bit closer to home and closer into the current moment, really profoundly important litigation against the race-based stop and frisk program that the NYPD had engaged in for so long. But after the 9/11 attacks, a large part of our institutional focus kind of shifted to the excesses, torture, executive detention regimes, and surveillance that was born out of counter-terror practices, for lack of a better word. And that is sort of my early introduction to this work. And so I thought I'd start by just sharing a story of one of my earlier experiences going to Guantanamo. And I want to say at the outset, before I share the story, that the point of sharing this is not to suggest in any way that somehow I have suffered in going to Guantanamo. My clients have suffered immensely, but it's just to sort of give you a taste of the way race can be lurking in sort of every aspect of this work. So I represented one of the last remaining juvenile detainees at Guantanamo. His name was Fahad Ghazi. He arrived at Guantanamo at age 17, was detained there until the age of 31 or 32 before he left. The first time he was cleared for release was all the way back in 2007. He was cleared again in 2012, and yet spent really a quarter of his life at Guantanamo waiting for release. An immensely warm and really, really intelligent person, was on his way to the University of Yemen before he was detained. And in the way that you would expect, someone who is going through indefinite detention to be curious about who it is that's on the outside that's helping him, Fahad asked me to bring him printouts. Because of the classification and security regime, not everyone working on his case could come and see him. And he wanted to see who are these people who are helping me. And so I dutifully printed off the images of the people who are working on his case, and get down to Guantanamo, and I'm being searched, and I'm being, all of my papers are being inspected before I go into the cell. And there's a military guy, like straight out of Central Casting, right, with a hat low and a very severe look, who's we're standing under hot sun. He's inspecting every piece of paper, and he gets to my photo, in a suit with my bio printed out below it, and he looks at it and he goes, "Now, which detainee is this?" And it just was this really kind of sobering reminder of in the sort of the matrix of power that I was in at Guantanamo, what side of the wire, at least some perceived me to sort of properly fit. But of course, race is really baked into the Guantanamo project from the very outset. One of the really stubborn myths about the men who have been detained there is that at some point they were all kind of squared off with U.S. soldiers, and they were captured and sent to Guantanamo in order to neutralize the threat that they posed, right? It's a convenient myth because it helps to explain the project at Guantanamo. But in fact, the U.S. government ran a slipshod and really expansive bounty-based system, and that system really relied on a explicitly race-based presumption about the threat posed by a Muslim and Arab men in that region, right? So you can, and I encourage you all to do that. You should Google the leaflets that the government littered on the landscape between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Stereotypically looking Arab individuals, right, with a equal sign, and then a picture of dollars, right? So it's, if you think about the sort of garbage in, garbage out sort of model, it makes sense that so many of the men at Guantanamo ended up being cleared not by progressive social justice litigators and advocates, but by the U.S. government itself, by all of the relevant national security agencies and regimes. The question of race also is built right into the jurisprudence around Guantanamo. So federal courts in D.C., for example, have taken the approach that one of the strong indicators of membership in the Taliban or membership in Al-Qaeda, any of those groups that would justify detention at Guantanamo, is evidence that you traveled along a specific route that other terrorists have been shown to use, other members of that group have been shown to use. And you think about how that works in like an American context. So someone you pull over on I-95 is presumptively a drug courier because the government can prove that other drug couriers have used that same specific route. It's built in this very, very strange presumption of who is a threat and who's not. But Guantanamo was not so exceptional, right? So the same kind of collapsing of identity and threat happened right here in New Jersey. So one of the cases that I've worked on at CCR for many years has been against the NYPD for its systematic surveillance of Muslim American communities throughout New Jersey. And in fact, one of our plaintiffs is the national chapter of the Muslim Students Association, because local chapters of MSAs, including the one here at Rutgers, was surveilled by the NYPD in a sort of dragnet sweep kind of program. After 9/11, the NYPD created what was called the Demographics Unit, which, among other things, mapped out really every aspect of Muslim American life in the tri-state, including by identifying ancestries of interest, which included Black Americans, African Americans in the NYPD's vocabulary, as presumptively of interest. Right? So the identities, like Muslim and race identities, collapse almost completely when you talk about the work of the national security state after 9/11. And just, one other example, in case it seems as though these things are contained to the sort of national security context, even with respect to our work on the surveillance of Black Lives Matter, some of the most kind of jarring documents coming out of DHS and FBI show this near obsessive fixation on the prospect that foreign terrorist groups would somehow co-opt the protests that were happening around, the crisis level police killings that we saw here in New York and Chicago and elsewhere. Again, I encourage you to take a look for yourself, right? But some of the things that were being surveilled were, or that were being built into the framework around surveillance, was this presumption that ISIS was actively recruiting members of Black Lives Matter that were protesting in Ferguson. And those things make their way into FBI situation reports that are the things that agents read right before they go out into police. So if you're wondering about the extreme militarized response that you see in the streets of Ferguson, that's exactly where at least part of the framing comes from. So I think you miss a lot if you forget how central race is to the sort of predicate presumptions about who's a threat, what needs to be policed, and how it needs to be treated, and how deserving some are of the protections of our law, however complicated and insufficient they may be, and who's not.
So I used to be out in the trenches advocating and litigating, and now I have the privilege and the challenge of trying to theorize and explain what's happening, rather than constantly describing what's happening such that one feels that it's just Groundhog Day every day. So I'll talk a little bit about the book that I'm coming out with called The Muslim Menace, The Racialization of Religion in the Post-9/11 Era, to try to historicize and contextualize what we're seeing today. Because as what Faiza Patel stated, it's not necessarily as new or as novel as we may think. It's simply that our education system has failed us dismally in terms of teaching us history, in particular critical history, which is part of the structure of liberalism. So first, the terrorist other stereotype existed before 9/11, but it was very narrow, and it wasn't as convenient, politically expedient, as it became after 9/11. So for example, particularly in the 90s, anyone who was a Palestinian activist was treated like a terrorist by the state. And if you look at the way that they were surveilled and prosecuted for supporting Hamas, which was effectively code for challenging the status quo in Israel and the Palestinian occupied territories, it was quite similar. But they were a very small group, and even Arabs and Muslims weren't paying attention to just how severely they were being treated. But if you look at what happened to them, it's not that different than what's happening after 9/11, except that after 9/11 it's expanded to anyone who is Muslim, Arab, and South Asian, or perceived as such, or associated with those people. If you're married to them, if you're working alongside those causes, as I do in every speech, I say hello to the FBI, welcome, marhaba, because they do surveil. And I'm not convinced that it stopped, frankly, but I'm very proud to be at Rutgers, because I consider it a badge of honor that they selected us to spy on us. That means we're doing something right. So, and the other issue that existed before and after 9/11 is the role of international relations. And this is part of the game, or the demagoguery and the indoctrination that all governments play, including the United States, in trying to persuade and scare its population to support blindly its foreign policy agenda. And the way you do that is you create a public enemy and you scare the people. And in the United States, it's even easier because there's usually a diaspora in light of the diversity of the population and the large immigrant community. There's a domestic diaspora that can then be used to distract the population and to justify certain types of empire-building activities, usually through military means, abroad. And if you look back at World War I and World War II, you had the Germans in World War I, and very few people may know that Germans were coercively pressured by the regime, by the United States government, to stop speaking German. And in fact, they prohibited them in many of the schools. And so the German language, they were bilingual. And that then was coercively quashed. In World War II, we know a lot about the Japanese and internment, but similarly, the Italians and the Germans were also subjected to surveillance. However, because they were white, it wasn't as severe. So white supremacy always still plays a role, at least in mitigating the effect, but they were too guilty by association. And we had to do that under the guise of, well, we don't know where their loyalties lie, we don't know if they actually are spies or double agents. Even though they have maybe second or third generation, they never travel back. There's no evidence to show that they could actually be spies or represent agents of foreign powers. And then in 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, there was a slew of anti-Iranian government actions, from special registration to deportations of Iranian students to questioning, etc. So all that is to say that these are not, unfortunately, these aren't new. It's simply that we aren't paying attention, and that's by design, that we're not informed of this kind of critical view of history. And so what happens also in 1990s, which is a key international event, is when communism was, quote unquote, defeated, the United States government found itself in a bit of a bind. It didn't have a public enemy anymore. It didn't have a way to scare the masses effectively. And so the red menace had to be replaced with something. And that's when the green menace became the new menace. And that started in the 90s, but we weren't really paying attention because it was mainly among the policy-making circles. And so 9/11 helped to take the green menace to the grassroots. And so much of what you see after 9/11, it's certainly worse in degree and in scope, but it's not that different in terms of the history of how we have treated diasporas, immigrants in the United States, and how that falls in line with our government's need to keep us ignorant consumers. Where that's also part of neoliberalism or the capitalist system, is to distract you. I study authoritarian regimes, and it's fascinating to see that the levels of apathy or the levels of apoliticalization is quite similar, but by different means. So in an authoritarian regime, it is through fear tactics, through arresting and prosecuting people as a message to scare anyone from even thinking about reforming the political system, and telling people, look, just focus on your daily life. Focus on taking your kids to school, educating them, making a living, stay out of politics, and let us, the authoritarian regime, take care of everything. Here, it's a different tactic. It's, why don't we distract you with the latest iPod and iPad and cars and material wealth? And the American dream is highly tied to the accumulation of wealth and purchasing consumer goods, and it's very anti-intellectual. And let us indoctrinate you with a certain version of history that will never make you question the status quo. And if you feel that you're getting jilted in some way or you're not benefiting from the system, well, it must be your fault. You must be lazy. You must not be smart enough. You must not be committed enough. Something's wrong with you as an individual, because surely it can't be the system that's creating this. So there's a lot at play in the background that makes 9/11 in many ways not as unique as we'd like to think it is, particularly those of us who are in it. And then finally, you can't underestimate the role of the industrial complex. And in every event or phenomena, there is always an industrial complex, meaning there are people and entities and organizations, both within the government, outside the government, who benefit politically and particularly economically from the phenomena. And so then they continue to perpetuate it. So in the post-9/11 war, global war on terror that's indefinite, that even though it's not called that now, we're still in that paradigm, there are military contractors, there are nonprofit organizations who get funds, there are pundits, There's a multi-million-dollar Islamophobia industry that literally raises up to $100 million a year to engage in Islamophobia. So they're making money. This is their livelihood. And all of this entire universe, this industrial complex, you have it around immigration, you have it around mass incarceration with the private prisons, is something that we tend not to focus on because, well, that's just capitalism. That's fair game. They're just trying to make a living, as if that isn't part of the source of oppression. So I'll in the next round, I'll be a little bit more specific about how this particularly applies to law schools and the way that you are being miseducated. Because I'm also a victim of being miseducated. And it's been very difficult to try to re-educate oneself. And I will tell you that when you go through the miseducation or re-education process, people will call you crazy, right? That's part of the system, is to tell you, if you see the sky's blue, they will tell you, no, the sky's green, you must have lost your sight. Right? There's something wrong with that. But that's also part of the system. So I'll talk more about that in the next round.
Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here today, and thank you for the students who organized this wonderful event. So I work in the Office of Rule of Law and Security Institutions of Department of Peace Operations. This office is responsible to support member states in undertaking reforms in their security sectors. United Nations has undertaken numerous efforts to actually make sure that member states have security institutions that are responsive to the needs of different segments of their societies. We have passed numerous Security Council resolutions. We also have supported numerous peace operations in different countries. And through these different efforts, United Nations, through its offices, has supported our member states to ensure that laws, legislations in different countries, as well as the mechanisms and institutions that are part of the broader security sector, respect human rights. Despite the fact that we have all these policies and resolutions set, by the United Nations General Assembly and also by the Security Council, we still have many challenges to ensure that our member states implement these resolutions and principles. And why is it important to actually reform the security institutions of the member states? And then I would like to come back to some issues that the speakers of this table have highlighted. The importance of really looking back to the historical roots of security sector institutions around the world. So if we look back, we can reflect a little more about the fact that the security sector institutions are in many ways product of a strong process of colonization. In many countries around the world, especially in the global south, security institutions were established as part of the colonization processes. So they were implemented by the colonizer as a way to ensure that that institution protects the colonizer again, from the other, from the black, from the indigenous people, from the Palestinians, from different. We can make reference to numerous processes of colonizations that we have in our history, and we're gonna always see the security institutions playing a very important part of these processes, and the security institutions, therefore, have been used as a tool to implement the races as a theory. Because even though we know that races does not exist as a biological fact, it exists as a social construct and has been implemented and designed as part of the security sector institutions and criminal justice as a whole. So when we speak about security sector institutions, we are making reference to the broader security sector, immigration, penitentiaries. We also have making reference to immigration, and as well as to the justice sector, the criminal justice. So I think it's important to look at the roots of these institutions and understand how they have been established. And over the time, you can also identify that many of these institutions, when countries went through independence, they also became a symbol of totalitarianism and dictatorship. And so we, as part of the United Nations, realized that in the entire world, the way that security institutions are behaving just does not reflect the needs of the entire population. It actually reflects the needs of the elites, the needs of the groups that are in power, the needs of the very privileged part of their societies. So how to transform that? This is really challenging. And it's part of our daily efforts in our office, but also part of my research and practice as a lawyer, for instance, when I was working as a lawyer in Brazil. And I think that as part of this experience, I really want to, in the second part, bring to you a little more in practice what we have been doing, and emphasize that if we really want to make some level of difference in the security sectors, that is a strong need for national commitment and strong need for senior decision makers take this agenda forward. While this agenda continues to be just as an international concept, as a very aspirational goal, we are all, against many forms of races. We all are against of many forms of discrimination. While we just stand on this belief and don't take it into practice, especially, into practice of the governments, it's still very difficult for any kind of organizations, not only UN, but also civil society, individuals to make a difference in this field. So, and I also want to emphasize that as part of races, Islamophobia has led security institutions not only to serve special groups. For instance, in the United States, we have, very strong examples of how the security institutions are behaving in the way that discriminate a group against another. But also, the way that the security institutions behave in national levels, for instance, in the United States, or even if we can compare, our colleague had brought a very good example about Israel. If we look at the way that both, for instance, states behave in terms of their security sector, we have to reflect on the impacts that this has to global security and in a more broader level. And because these security institutions and the way that they behave have been, being shown by the media, has been shown by, is a way actually to spread a message around other member states on how the security institutions should behave. So if, for instance, security institutions in Europe are being shown by the media to block many refugees of entering their state, refugees that are seeking asylum. And if the security institutions are behaving in such a way, and that is being demonstrated by the media as, that's why it's really important to look at the narratives that the media use to demonstrate such kind of behaviors. What happens is a strong demonstration that these institutions are still representing really a very one piece of the segment of the society and government. Because as you know, it's not crime to cross a border to seek asylum. So why the security institutions are treating refugees as criminals? So the fact that, this really turn of values and turn of who they are serving and who they are representing. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you all. It's already been very interesting and a lot to say. You all seem to have a sense already of where you'd like to go in your next round, but let me just present some of the questions that we've thought of in advance. Omar, you already talked some about your work with Guantanamo Bay inmates. Can you tell us something about how that's gotten more difficult under President Trump and where you see some of that work going?
Yeah, I mean, not to dodge the question, but it was really hard under the Bush administration, and it was really, really hard under the Obama administration, as much as that seems like a lifetime ago. I mean, so let me, I want to sort of talk about a specific case because I think it helps illustrate both the difficulty with trying to win the freedom of the men at Guantanamo under the Obama administration, and why, as difficult as that was, it's become so much more difficult. Right? So I represented a man named Tariq Bauda for about 10 years before he was released. He had a very specific view of, he would be fantastic on this panel, he had a very specific view of the way his identity and race was the thing that, and in his Muslim identity was the thing that landed him at Guantanamo. He used to talk about being sold into a 21st century slavery market. He used to talk in really kind of eloquent and searing terms about the way the military and courts and media sort of collapsed into one structure of power that kept him locked up at Guantanamo and away from his family. And so had very little interest in litigating his case, and in fact for many years wouldn't even meet with me, though I was his lawyer. And decided really early on in his time at Guantanamo to embrace a hunger strike that he committed to continue until either his body gave out or he was released. And he in fact did that. He was on hunger strike for 9 uninterrupted years. He was force-fed twice a day by the military personnel at Guantanamo, which at Guantanamo, if you don't know, means nasogastric intubation, so a tube through the nose to pump liquid into his stomach. And he was absolutely steadfast that he was going to insist through his protest that he reflect back to the Guantanamo staff just how ugly and brutal the administration of Guantanamo detention really is, and what it means to put someone in a steel and concrete cell for, and not tell them exactly why they're there. Remember, the allegations against these men are predominantly classified, so they don't actually have a full sense of why the government claims they should need to be there or how long they'll end up staying. Eventually, his health became disastrously sort of compromised. At the time, towards the end of his detention, he had withered away to about 74.5 pounds. That was, by the government statistic, 56% of his ideal body weight. The emergency motion that we filed at the Center for Constitutional Rights to get him to medical care included I think an honest assessment of just where he was. The government refused to allow medical doctors, independent medical doctors, to see him. But even on those basic medical statistics, we had just really shocking and sobering, I should say, medical assessment of just the risks that he was facing. And so when I filed that motion, I did something else, which was to simply ask the government not to contest it, not to oppose my motion for his release, right? Because the NDA, one of the statutes that governs detention at Guantanamo insists that unless there is approval from the government, from the Secretary of Defense, the only way out of Guantanamo is by court order. So if the government would simply lie down in the case, the judge could stamp an order and Tariq would have been able to get medical care. The government refused to do that. What we understand now from public reporting is that there was a deep internal division between Department of Defense, Department of Justice, and Department of State of how to deal with this individual. Department of State that was in the business of trying to figure out how to resettle these men out of Guantanamo, consistent with the Obama administration's policy, wanted him to be released. But the Department of Defense reflexively defended its detention administration and had a perspective that really what was happening was Tariq was trying to game the system by forcing himself to be sick so that he could get his free. And I think that also builds in this discussion of race, right? You have to have a very strange notion of the humanity of this particular individual to think that he could do that in order to somehow trick the system. But that is one of the pressure points that we consistently used in litigation in order to try to help men get out. Under the Trump administration, that's entirely possible, right? So there's complete consistency across the board. If the departments are even staffed adequately to take on some of these challenges, we know that there's absolute hostility towards a release, which means the only recourse we have is in the court. And yet, jurisprudence around Guantanamo is absolutely designed. It's not really a thumb on the scale. It's just the game as judges in the D.C. Circuit have said the game is called in the government's favor before we even get into court. And so we have trying now, we're at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeal to insist that the courts recognize that the due process clause must extend to Guantanamo, right? The men at Guantanamo must have, and it's just a very simple, the due process clause, I think, in this context really translates to something very simple, which is when is enough, right? Is it 17 years of indefinite detention without charge or trial? If we get to the 20-year mark, then can we confidently say that whatever the circumstances of the original detention determination, these men have paid enough, especially considering that they have not been tried and many of them will never be tried? And so that's the challenge that we're facing. But ultimately, there's absolutely no executive will to release these men. And in fact, executive prerogative is cuts in the other direction. So we are constantly hearing about, and executive orders were leaked, draft form executive orders were leaked, preparing to increase the population at Guantanamo. And I'll say this before I stop. The reason, there are only 40 men at Guantanamo. Probably, how many are we here? We're almost, we might outnumber the Guantanamo population in this room at this time. The reason it remains so important is that I honestly believe it is a beachhead, right? It's a declaration of what's possible and what's acceptable in terms of the degradation and abuse of people so long as they're black, brown, and Muslim, and it has incredible symbolic force in that sense. As long as that is hanging out there, right, some of the other things that are happening here, the surveillance, the highly militarized response to black and brown political speech, all of it is just a little bit more acceptable, and I think that's why it'll be a hell of a fight to finally see that system dismantled.
Oh, thank you. Sahar, you brought us really up to the beginning of this with the history, but the specific question for now is how have national security concerns been warped by Islamophobia since 9/11?
Okay. So kind of going back to my original comments, or my first initial comments, is Islamophobia is just a different version of the same thing. And again, the goal is to not exceptionalize what's happening. But I want to talk a little bit about the fraud that's being conducted on many of you as law students, because it's one thing to go into a system with your eyes wide open and understanding what you're getting into. It's a whole different thing to not realize it and to be part of the problem, but be able to go to sleep at night thinking you're acting in good faith. And part of that is the responsibility, I think, of law professors. And I think that based on what I've seen over the past 8 years in the academy and having been in the trenches, is that I am woefully disappointed in the legal education system here and in law schools. And I think that there's blood on their hands in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, the killing of black men because they're training the prosecutors and they're training the judges. And I think there's blood on their hands in terms of the national security government complex in particular, because they also train the lawyers that go into the FBI and that go into the Department of Justice, et cetera. And many legislators are lawyers. And they don't seem to think they are responsible for that in any way. It's quite fascinating how law professors and law schools just think, well, that's really not my problem, because it's those alumni, they make those decisions for themselves as if we had no role in setting the paradigm. So there's the liberalism approach, which is essentially legal education is the liberal approach, or if not outright conservative, if you go to schools like George Mason, which proudly claims that. I think Pepperdine claims that, and some other schools. And then there's the critical progressive approach, which very few schools have. I think Rutgers aspires to it. I don't think it has met the goal. And hopefully some of us rabble-rousers in the faculty will try to push it more towards that, because this is not the People's Electric Law School anymore. It used to be, but it is not. And I think all of you know that. And I think the faculty have an important role to play in trying to bring that back. Okay, so liberalism is what? At least in terms of the context we're in law schools. So first, it accepts the current legal system as it exists. It doesn't challenge the very system. And then it just takes issue with the failure to implement it. So it's not that there's anything wrong with the law or the courts or the political system, it's just that it's not being fairly implemented, or it's not consistently being applied, and so there are double standards. So if only we would just apply anti-discrimination laws more robustly and across more groups, then we wouldn't have racism. If only we would not profile but we could leave the national security apparatus as is, then we wouldn't have at least government forms of Islamophobia. And liberalism individualizes repression, state repression, and individualizes remedies. So it takes you from the group base to the individual base. And therefore, you buy people out, is what you do. You just buy people out of repression, but you keep the repression, you keep the system the same. It doesn't challenge racial, religious, and gender hierarchies that are infused within the law, they're infused within our courts, they're infused within the actual structures. It just targets certain people and said, well, that's a bad apple. That's an anomaly. This person is an outlier. And that's essentially what you're trained to be thinking when you see bad behavior and bad conduct, rather than thinking about how does the structure actually work. And it also trusts the current political system as offering equal opportunity and offering, and that the burden of equality or seeking equality is on the subordinated communities to play by the game as if the game isn't rigged. So for example, if you don't like what the police are doing, well, you just should vote. You should just run for office. You should just become a judge, right? Go out there and change the system from within, because you, belonging to a subordinated minority or gender, can do that. You're a superhero, right? No, you're not. You can't. You're part of a system and a structure. And when you go in and try to change it, do you know what happens to you? You're purged. You're fired. You're prosecuted. You're silenced. You're marginalized. And therefore, the entrance, the permission or the entrance of subordinated individuals from subordinated communities is on condition that you keep the system as it is. Maybe we'll give you a little bit of marginal room to change things, which we call diversity, right? And diversity, who does diversity actually serve? It serves whites. It doesn't serve minorities. It's not a remedial program, right? That's why affirmative action is being eliminated and being replaced with diversity. And the reason why it serves whites and the wealthy, whatever race they may be, is because it gives exposure to their kids so that they won't be too provincial, so that they can be exposed to international people in different cultures, so that they can get jobs too, because God forbid we wouldn't want them to be too harmed by the segregated societies that we live in, which minimize their ability to be exposed in a globalized economy. So diversity is really there to serve the powerful, and then the bones are given to those diverse people who usually have to deal with stereotype threat representing the race problems, and they're such a small number that it's not as if they're able to benefit from being kind of true equal members of that particular community. So the critical progressive response, if you haven't figured it out through what I'm implying, and the other thing before I get there is the judicialization of politics is a really key part of what we do in this country and in many countries, which is what we do is we take politics and we put it into the courts and instead of the streets. And therefore, the judges then have all this power, and the judges are primed and indoctrinated, even the so-called liberal judges, to keep the system as structured, because if you have an interest in that. And it really comes to the forefront if you go and speak with social scientists, and this happens to me quite frequently, is social scientists find law professors in general and lawyers in particular to be delusional, because we all have this fetish with the courts. We think, oh, if you go to court, if you litigate, you will get your rights. As if the courts aren't part of the system and part of the problem. And we don't have all these other processes like the individualization of remedy and like the continuation, as if the judges are somehow not affected by the system. So this judicialization of politics is something that we do at law schools as part of our own self-interest in our own industrial complex, keeping the system. So the critical progressive response comes with the position that says, look, the system is rigged in favor of the powerful, and the powerful can be different groups depending on the society. So just, when people say white supremacy, that's not saying all white people are devils. This isn't the Nation of Islam rhetoric. This is saying that whites in this particular country are the powerful as a group, and that system isn't going to change. Right? And you can find a different group in a different country. So therefore, you have to overhaul the entire system and the fundamental causes of oppression against Muslims, Arabs, South Asians, i.e. in Islamophobia, that are the same causes of oppression against blacks, Latinos, immigrants, whatever the subordinated group that you want to identify with. And they're all interconnected. It took Muslims a really long time to figure that out. It took them about 15, 16 years. They just now started to get involved in the cross-racialization, or cross-racial alliances. But the point is, you can't really talk about one phobia or one racism or one ism without understanding that it's all part of the same system. And so just a few other things about the system. It infuses white supremacy and patriarchy, right, within the legal and political system. This is a settler colonial society. It is not an immigrant community society. This is a settler colonial society, and all of us are beneficiaries of that, and we benefited from the annihilation of an entire people, the Native Americans. And we just have to accept that. It's based on the exploitation of immigrant labor. There's a reason why we continue to let immigrants in, because they're cheaper, they work harder, because not because they're immigrants, but we are bringing a certain type of immigrant, and there's a huge brain drain that's happening, and we're bringing the best and the brightest and the hardest working from their countries who have invested health, education, shelter, food, nutrition, all that. That country has invested, and then we take them at their prime. And they come here and they invest in this society, and they make the wealthy wealthier, which is why the most pro-immigrant group are not the poor whites and the rural whites. It's the wealthy. But what they've done, and this is part of the American story, and this happens in every society, is that the wealthy have to find divisions. So they'll take the poor and lower middle class whites, that's Trump doing this now, and pitting them against the minorities and the immigrants and saying they're the ones that are stealing everything from you. When in fact it's the elites that are taking everything. It's the elites that have the wealth inequality. It's not minorities that are in that top 1%, at least as a group. So I will just end with one example, and then just telling you that when you learn about free speech, freedom of religion, voting rights, equal protection, due process, civil and criminal procedure, all of those are so-called ways to. They're all within a boundary, and you as lawyers will always be limited to that boundary. And that boundary is by design, and it will keep the structure in place. So don't be delusional and think, oh, well, we have the First Amendment. We have this, we have that. Except you can still engage in islamophobia that causes direct harm to individuals, and it's protected by free speech. Well, why don't you just compete for the free marketplace of ideas? Okay, how about all of you have a problem with the way that our government is engaging in speech in our mainstream media? I challenge you, I suggest to you, go talk to CNN and say, I have something to say. I'd like to write an op-ed in the New York Times. I'd like to write an op-ed in the Washington Post. I want to compete in the marketplace of ideas. Do you think you're going to be accepted? You will not, because you don't have equal access to the marketplace of ideas. And that's the fundamental problem with the free speech doctrine. But if you're a member of the majority, it doesn't matter if somebody insults you, because your power protects you. But if you're a member of the subordinated minorities and someone insults you, you could lose your job. Right? You could get beaten, and the police may not respond in the same way. You don't have security fences and all sorts of ways to protect yourself based on your wealth. So finally, I'll just end with a little example, which when I saw it, I thought, wow, this is in play. It's been intriguing and somewhat refreshing, but then disappointing, that there seems to be a discussion about reparations again. So reparations for African Americans. This was an issue in the 90s when I was coming of age, and it was a non-starter. It was very polarizing. And now it seems like there's some conversation. I think it's a lot of politicking by the Democrats. But here's what I find so amusing, but then not. It's anticipated. What is it that all the liberal Democrats are supporting for reparations? Let's create a task force. And then we need to think about it and talk about it. So one of the strategies of our legal system is to bureaucratize reform. And this is what authoritarian regimes do. It's brilliant. Like the sophisticated authoritarian regimes, of course we care, of course. We're going to create a task force. We're going to create a committee. We're going to create, and that's going to drag its feet and go on, and every time you complain, we're doing something about it. But there's no actual address to, no one wants to have that substantive conversation about it. No one wants to talk about why are the immigrants more socially mobile. Why am I here, and I'm an immigrant, I was born abroad. Why am I here? I mean, it's a big deal that I'm a law professor. And as a group, African Americans are woefully underrepresented. So we have to be thinking about what's the system that created that. So I'll just end by saying we are going to create a social justice salon in the school. The law professors who are trying to re-educate you, hopefully not so much that you won't become a lawyer, because we do want you to still be a lawyer, but be one that can be wide-eyed in understanding the system you're in. And we will be talking about these issues through a more critical, progressive approach so that you're exposed, at least you understand, and then you're going to have to make your informed decisions. But right now, you are not informed.
I want to now just bring you to, in terms of, more of a practical reflection, what we have been doing in different levels within our very limited capacities. Because when we reflect about United Nations, we all think that's an organization that has, a lot of power to make change and resources to do so. We have power to make some change and some resources to do, to undertake some of these changes. But this is really goes into the point that the government is willing to do that change. United Nations is an organization formed by, member states and represents in many ways the inequality that we have in the international relations and the, power relations that are just there, as part of capitalism, as part of international relations as a whole. So our bodies also represent that inequality in many ways. And it's part of, it's our responsibility as law practitioners to really reflect on these issues, not only at national level, but also international level. And I think bring this reflection to your studies and research is just a very powerful way to change some of these narratives and have a more critical view about these different institutions and how they can, really in some way represent better your interests, the interests of minorities as well. And I think going to that, for instance, I think when, for instance, the United Nations engages with one of our member states, and we usually, our office do so especially in post-conflict countries. So countries that have undergone through a long, period of war. After that, once we have a peace agreement or we support the country to reach the peace agreement, we have an entire process that will support different, armed groups and different parts of the conflict to implement the peace agreement. Usually these wars are already, in many cases, without generalizing, a result of racism, of ethnic divisions, of situations where armed groups or security institutions were just fighting against one another because of beliefs of racism. So the reform that will take place after the peace agreement is really a reform that can be very transformative for the entire society. Some key steps that are necessary, and even to when I was in academia, I thought they were very bureaucratic and they were very just a part of the system as a whole, is the ones that in the field actually make changes. So I think that that's really important to emphasize. And I think that when you bring, for instance, however you want to call it, if you want to call a committee, if you want to call a task force, but when you bring, for instance, different parts of armed groups into a committee with the government and try to promote the dialogue that will lead later to a strategy, for instance, a document. It is a document. When I was in the students' movement and when I was in many research, I thought this would just be a step or a way, to actually delay things. When you bring that, for instance, in a strategy, they identify key threats to the country into the different groups of society. And a strategy that can lead the reform of security institutions to different steps, for instance, in recruitment. Why security institutions respond to society in different ways? Because sometimes they are formed by not all the members of that society. If we want to reflect on Islamophobia, we need to reflect on how many Muslims we have in the security institutions here, other countries, because their perspectives need to be included in the security operations and processes. And for that to happen is a very practical step. Ensure target recruitments, ensure that we have a target for different groups and ethnic groups as part of the security sector. This is actually a very important step, simple, that makes a huge difference in ensuring that security institutions are representative, that they look like as the society that they represent, because sometimes what we see today is security institutions that are only formed by men, white men, and that's the most cases in the entire world. And how to change that and to make sure that these institutions are more representative, and including these groups as part of these processes is really the practical work. Is the practical work of supporting these institutions to do recruitments. ensuring that penitentiaries have, for instance, correction officers that represent the entire system. You know, I mean, we understand that the system as a whole is problematic because of its colonial roots. But what are the practical steps that we're going to take when we undertake our research event to make such a change? To change, of course, the narrative. We understand that this is a process that results from colonization. We understand that the rationale that's behind these institutions. But what are going to be the practical steps that we're going to take? In the criminal justice, or when we look at the cases and the judgments of the courts, what are the kind of judges that we have there? Are they representing all of us or not? You know, in different states, that's a different analysis that's necessary. And I think that's the analysis that should also be part, and it's a responsibility of law students as producers and of legal knowledge. Because the legal knowledge, as we all know, it has been very well emphasized here, is a product also of colonization. Our knowledge has been colonized. And in the global south, I come from Brazil, it took me a very long time to finally find Edward Said and Franz Fanon that really shaped the way that I saw these issues, you know, in a different manner, because they were not in my mandatory reading when I first started this law school. So really, like, I think, so just as a way forward, sorry, I'm taking a little more minutes. I think it's really important to change the narrative, reflect on what you have been reading, reflecting on who are your professors, how representative these spaces are, but then taking practical steps. As academia, you are representative of a civil society, of organization with a lot of power, because you design knowledge, you are part of the production of this knowledge. And you have, therefore, especially in the United States, in a country where you have the right to speak. Because many countries and many students around the world that are law students that are generating amazing knowledge, they don't have the right to speak. They don't have the right to publish books. They don't have the access to the publication of books. They don't have access to that dialogue even. So you have a lot of responsibility because you are here in the United States. And I know you understand that you have many challenges and internal dynamics that you have to go through to be part of this, and this is also being emphasized because you're part of a diverse society. But still, I mean, that discussion needs to be taken to the practical, you know, to really mobilizing government, civil society actors to make a difference, to go back and visit security institutions in your country and really check how is your recruitment going? What are the targets that you have? What are the laws and policies that really define how security sector institutions should be formed, how they should be implementing their security operations? You know, how many people has the police killed in the last year? What are the color of these people? Why these security institutions are, for some reasons, you know, killing more this segment of society than the other. In my case, in Brazil, around 5,000 people were killed by the police last year. The majority of this population were black and young. Why? Is my security institution in my country really representative? Probably not. So I think it's really, I conclude in really asking for that reflection on how we can bring these issues to practice and how we can really find these spaces of dialogue. Because sometimes we feel very, you know, these dialogues are just very segmented, we're just talking to each other. In Brazil, because of the academia, where the progressive knowledge is being built, has been so segmented and just talking to themselves. They didn't transfer that knowledge to critical parts of society, and they did not support the building of our democracy, and look what we have right now. So it's really a matter of, you know, finding this space of dialogue. You need to talk with your government. You need to talk with your justice sector. Cannot be just limited to here. And you need to be part of the suggestions and recommendations for change. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in the second round. We have time for each of you to speak for 4 or 5 more minutes again. And I'd ask you to reflect on what other panelists have said. Germana has already started that. The one specific question I think I'll ask is, knowing that about the work of the Center for Constitutional Rights, I wonder what Omar's take is on the role of the courts and legal actions to fight Islamophobia, national security state, et cetera.
So first, I can't support and sort of lift up enough Professor Aziz's comments about how cynical you all should be about the law. And it's not, and surely that's radical, and we talk about it in those terms, but I think it's just like sort of the predicate step to doing good work in this field, right? The simplest way, I think, to sort of think about it, this is something I try to return to all the time in my career, is that, just the distance between what's lawful and what's just sometimes is immense, and one of the things that happens in law school and one of the things that happens in legal practice is that we fetishize competence, legal technical competence, in a way that makes it really easy to collapse those two things, right? So if you can arrive at a viable legal answer, quote unquote, to a situation, that you've done your job. And I just think it's really has everything completely backwards, right? The question has to always be for, I think, legal practitioners, especially if you want to be a movement lawyer, you want to lawyer in service of people, is to ask yourself what's just, and then recognize that by virtue of your privilege and the information that you have a tool that you can offer to try to accomplish that. But the first step is also really recognizing that you don't know what's just. Oftentimes, and I've certainly been in this position, I've been absolutely exercised by some injustice, something wrong that I'm seeing, and find out from listening, humbly listening to clients of mine, that like what I'm pissed about and what I think is the thing that we need to attack is not the issue at all. One example of that close to home, I think, is the surveillance work that the Center for Constitutional Rights has done with the Muslim community here in New Jersey. For sure, and this is something that we'd had plenty of conversations about, the actual process of surveilling, the process of showing up, for example, at one of our clients' homes here in Newark and monitoring the little girls that were going into her home that she was teaching, because she ran a girls' school out of her home, and officers taking notes about the racial composition of the school-age girls that were going in, was certainly, it was infuriating. It was wrong. The Muslim community here, just like in the way that we've been talking all afternoon so far, is perfectly aware of these bedrock constitutional principles and wants to enjoy them in the same way that other Americans do, but it just wasn't the thing, right? It just wasn't that. The problem was the classification itself, right? The use of racial identity, of ethnic background, as a proxy for criminality, as a proxy for a threat. That classification was demeaning. It degraded a community that had immense pride and immense family bonds. Some of the plaintiffs that we work with are people who came to the case separately but grew up together. They were family in many ways. And to be viewed in that way was something that was absolutely destructive. And so our job then is of course, to understand the scope of surveillance and figure out ways to translate that into legal doctrine and tell the Third Circuit exactly what they should know about it, and we certainly did that. But part of what we also had to do was to think about, how do we build into our legal case something that speaks specifically to what our clients are saying the thing is. And so amongst our theory of damages was a claim for dignitary harm. And we had to go through some really complicated processes to figure out, how do you actually start to make someone whole for demeaning them? That's the kind of thing that you don't understand, you don't learn unless you spend time actually listening and focusing on justice rather than what the legal solutions are. And the same thing has always been true in Guantanamo. Right now, one of my colleagues is at Guantanamo at a trial in order to mitigate the sentence of one of our clients. This is an individual who was tortured in really, and I say this without hyperbole, medieval ways by the CIA. And we're saying, I think, something that's very, very commonsensical, very just. If you're going to punish this man, let's also take into consideration the things that this government has done, the brutal things that this government has done to him already, because surely any fair notion of justice will account for what he's already suffered. And the government's fighting like hell to prevent us from bringing in that information, right? That is a consistent part of what it takes. And I see you, and thanks for trying to keep us on time. That is, it's not by mistake that the government fights that so much, right? Because I think part of this work of trying to figure out how to bring justice closer to what's lawful is accountability. We talk about solutions, we talk about remedies, but accountability is to me the sort of the most important thing. So many of the people that we work with at the Center for Constitutional Rights, individuals that I've represented, really dignity is the thing that they are most concerned with trying to reclaim, because the sort of abuse, especially in the national security state, that people are forced to endure, by definition is shameful. We are representing survivors of the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, and I've learned now that we've come so far past that time that I have to sometimes remind people what Abu Ghraib was, right? This notorious detention facility in Iraq where some of really just sort of barbaric torture practices were happening. Images of that torture were leaked and stunned the world for years. We are representing those individuals, and the private corporation that we are fighting against, CACI, has filed 17 successive dispositive motions attempting to get that case knocked out of court. They do not want to have our plaintiffs have their day in court. Those individuals can't even come to the United States to appear in court, right? So why is there so much? Why is that so important? Because accountability, right? The idea that at some point the national security state will have to, instead of displacing shame onto the victims of its crime and forcing those individuals to pathologize it, has to claim its own shame, right, for the things that it's done, which frees up space for our clients to reclaim some of their dignity. I'll say this in closing. Some of my work now with the Center for Constitutional Rights, it gives me occasion to go to the South, and I just 2 weeks ago was in Montgomery at the Memorial for Justice and Peace, the lynching memorial that the Equal Justice Initiative has created, and I can't encourage you all enough to go there. It's an absolutely devastating memorial to the history of racial terror and lynching in the South. There are installations that represent counties where lynching has happened, with names of the victims as best as the histories have allowed people to reclaim. But one of the parts of the memorial that was just, I think, so profound is that once you pass out of the main installation, replicas of those installations are displayed with a simple invitation for all of the counties where these atrocities have happened to come and claim their installation, to take it back and to display it. And I think it's such a profound statement of what the moral obligation is to claim for our government, for the perpetrators of this kind of state violence, to claim their responsibility and their shame for having participated in it. Because without that, I don't think we're going to be able to do much reconciling with this question of where the law stops and where the demands of people begin and where justice actually resides.
There's a reason why I left litigation. Primarily because I realized that taking 10 to 15 years to get justice, or not to get justice, excuse me, to get a remedy was not just, and I lost faith in the process enough to feel that I could do something different somewhere else. That's not to say that litigation isn't important, and it's one of the tools. But again, for those of you who hopefully will become litigators, to just walk in with your eyes open and know the limitations of what you're doing and not think that's the only thing to do. And part of that is also when you study law, and I don't think that, something that I struggle with as a law professor of constantly trying to both teach the law but also teach students how to identify who are the winners and losers. There are always winners and losers. Even if you're the one making the rule, you're still making a rule where there are winners and losers. Nothing is perfect. But taking something without critically thinking and assuming, oh, well, that's what they say it is, then it must be okay. It must be right. It must be just. That's where we are not educating you. That's where we're just indoctrinating you. So I would encourage you, because many of you will be out there working in the trenches, is that you understand not just the doctrine, not just the statute, not just the jurisprudence, but be able to look at it holistically and go, what are the flaws in this? Who does it harm? Who does it benefit more or less? And identify what it is that you can and cannot do through your own professional endeavors, and then perhaps figure out ways where you can contribute to other things to do, either by giving money. I think there's nothing wrong with giving money, because the Center for Constitutional Rights needs money to do its work. And that's, you need money to give money, or pro bono work, or changing your path, your career path, which is what I ultimately did. If you have that option to say, I think my time is better spent doing this instead of that. But one of the things I just want to highlight and kind of end with is, well, two things. The first is, you have got to stop believing in American exceptionalism. I think that is the ultimate intellectual travesty that we are all taught from kindergarten. It's brilliant. I mean, our government's brilliant in that way, to teach us about American we're special, we're different, we're unique. It's not true. It's not necessarily that we're inferior or worse than other countries, but we're humans like everybody else, and our system is unfair, and it has many imperfections that don't exist in other societies. And what I always, again, if you do the comparative work and the international work and you travel, really it becomes into stark contrast, where you can see how there are so many things that happen here that may happen somewhere else, and when we see it somewhere else, it's unacceptable. How can they do this? But we never look in the mirror and realize we're doing the same thing. I mean, when you talk about what happens in Guantanamo, you could be, all of us, if he were to change it and say, talking about X country in the Middle East, most people in America would go, oh yeah, I totally believe that. And yet, it's our government is doing this. It's our government that tortured people in medieval ways, and yet we're indoctrinated to think it's those other dictatorships, it's those other brown people, those other black people, those other inferior people. So come to terms with the fact that your country is not exceptional, and that you, like my panelists have said, bear a really weighty responsibility. And I think that's probably the most difficult thing to deal with as a law student, as a lawyer, is in contrast to others, you really have no pass. You don't get a pass. You have so much privilege, and you have to take that responsibility and that burden on to educate yourself and to do something about it. And finally, the thing that tends, with Islamophobia, an issue that tends not to come up is the way in which the hierarchies in our society are integrated and incorporated into the subordinated community's psyche and relations with each other. And this is a challenge that, particularly those of us who work with those communities or belong to those communities, is a real challenge. So you're dealing both with the intra-community hierarchies and the inter-community hierarchies, and they are related, meaning there's a lot of self-loathing, there's a lot of crabs in the basket behavior, there's a lot of patriarchal females, there's the whole model minority phenomena where you're just trying to please those in power and try to adapt to what they want and expect. And there's the homogenization of your own community, where you have your own version of the good Muslim or the good woman or the good black person or the good man within your communities, and then you start repressing your own. And that's something that I don't think is discussed enough among those who care about these issues, where we tend to focus too much on the inter-community as if the hierarchies of society are not infecting us. And in fact, one could argue that one of the reasons why these communities have been not as successful as they arguably could in at least pushing back against these hierarchies is because they have incorporated them, within their own psyches. So just be thinking about that if you belong to those communities. And then finally, I'll end with just, of course, putting a pitch for the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, because I did attempt to start this center at another institution, and it may come as no surprise that it was an utter failure, because those who opposed it, whom were many, saw it as reverse racism, saw it as unnecessary. We don't really have a serious problem, and saw it as a threat, and that it would bring too much negative attention to the institution, and that it wasn't worth the cost, because everything is about capital rights, all about making money. So I say that to credit Rutgers, and to credit Rutgers Newark in particular, because you all do not know what you have. It's not the People's Electric Law School, but it's also a lot better than about 97% of other law schools. You have the space and enough faculty, critical numbers of faculty, to really grow and thrive through critical thinking and a more critical, progressive approach to the law. And I hope that you'll take advantage of it, because you won't realize it until you leave just how repressive our profession is. It's very sexist. It's very racist. It's very classist. And I anticipate many of you will be back visiting me, telling me that, and I'll say, yes, I've been there, done that. And I will just give you a little tissue and say, go back out there and fight. But take advantage of this environment and be part of that change. Something else that students don't realize is that you all are not passive actors. I mean, you created this conference, right? You're here, you organized it, you attended it, and don't blame other people. Take the initiative. If you're unhappy with the way the faculty is handling things, address it. Don't say, well, it's the faculty's fault, right? Or it's the administration's fault. So learn your advocacy skills here and feel that you're empowered to change that system instead of just being a consumer of information, but also produce change and think, what's that legacy that you want to leave behind, that had someone before you left it behind, maybe it wouldn't be so difficult for you, whatever that may be. And with that, I do hope that you all will continue to stay engaged, at least with this center, because my goal is to not direct it in 5 years, to have somebody else direct it, right? To not make it, you have to be building institutions, not building fan bases, not building self-aggrandizing endeavors. But it really has to be an institution, and this is something you need to be thinking about, is what are the institutions and legacies that you're going to be building as you move through life and ultimately end up where we all end up, in the ground. So let's keep that in mind. Thank you.
I did say we were covering a lot of ground on this panel.
So in the security sector reform processes, we consider the academia, students, and law schools especially as a very important actor in terms of providing oversight and ensuring the accountability, the mechanisms of accountabilities are in place in terms of how security institutions should behave as a whole, from the armed forces to the police officers in the ground. So I just want to emphasize how important it is to have some level of equilibrium between these different actors. Because when we speak about security sector, speaking about, and it's interesting because when you are looking at a more global level and you analyze how each state behave and how each state decided to compose its security sector, you identify the importance of having some level of equilibrium between the different actors. You have to understand yourself as part of the security sector, as part of these groups that compose the security of a country. Why is that? Because first we have the main institutions of the government, but then secondly, we're gonna have the groups that are play this very important and essential role, which is to provide oversight and to really, look at the security institutions in a way that, understand how they behave, are they respecting human rights or not? So, and produce, for instance, in the case of academia, but also other civil society groups, knowledge about it. But what I say is that when you produce knowledge about the security sector institutions, whether or not they are respecting international human rights law, why, for instance, your government has decided to sign or not to sign, an international convention pertaining some of these issues. When you look at these issues, it's very important to take an antagonistic approach, but also to take but bringing our conclusion ways that you can also dialogue. Because sometimes we take very strong antagonist approach and we lose the opportunity to dialogue, because one of the main challenges for the oversight mechanisms is the fact that it's just so antagonistic, because there is so much frustration in these groups because of what's happening, and there are reasons to be frustrated. That the antagonist, we just end up, when I was in civil society as well, we take just such an antagonist approach that we are able to dialogue with the government. So the importance of building a narrative that also communicates to the government institutions. Because it's when we think of security sector, how you really, in your practice of work, for instance, in the United Nations, how are we going to convince a government to make changes in its security institutions, to sit, for instance, with, a military, a general of the armed forces in the ground, in a country that we support? How are we going to communicate these issues in a way that are convincing, that the armed force general really want at the end to include more ethnic groups that's not from his ethnic group in the security sector institutions? So how you build a narrative that communicate a little better with the security sector, with the government? How do you do that? Demonstrating that, for instance, while you include more, ethnic groups that are not yet represented in the security institutions, you actually going to increase your efficiency. The security services that you're going to deliver are going to be more responsive, and actually, at the end, you're going to lead to a reduction of violence and more operational efficiency for the security institution as a whole. So when you build a narrative that also meets some of the targets and goals of the government, of the security institutions, you have much more chance to be convincing and to make a change. And then I bring the other part, the importance also that these movements and the academia and the law students and professors and practitioners having in changing some of this knowledge in a way that this knowledge is more diverse. Many of the patterns, the standards that security sector institutions around the world adopt today, they come from patterns and standards that were developed in the Western world. So how can we also, bring a little some more fresh reflection in terms of how is the security sector that we want for our future? How it should look like? Should carry guns? Shouldn't? We really think on these more broad issues in terms of what is the future that we want as a society, first here in the United States, but more globally. Because this Western concept of security is very heavy-handed. It's still, it's very armed. It's, linked with many forms of industries that support some of these institutions to behave that way. It's uniform in a way that's not attractive to people. Especially for instance, in Africa, where we have most of our operations. We have so many other traditional ways to, serve society, provide security services to society that are not linked with being armed, with having uniforms, with having, very expensive institutions in the state that could be much more efficient than the institutions that we have available up to now. So really having that reflection is important, and changing a bit of this narrative. Why we also write in a way that also dialogues with the other that we criticize. And that's an essential element of producing and making a change in this process of accountability, in this process of helping the institution to meet accountability standards. Thank you.
Thank you all. We have time for a couple of questions.